As he watched his day of reckoning, Lieutenant James Carton could not have imagined what this day would lead to. He was just a witness in a theft case. A simple case. A simple testimony. But what happened in the courtroom made him stand as still as ever before, ready for any situation, because at that moment, his every move could have caused an explosion. The royal guard in full ceremonial uniform, with his red tunic and huge hat, did not look like an ordinary witness. This provoked an unexpected reaction from the judge, a man who for 25 years has been considered the supreme authority in his courtroom, and who others are mostly afraid to even look at. He began to treat the guardsman with disdain, calling him a clown and a theater character, not even realizing that he was not just standing there as part of the scenery. This day will be the moment when Lake's disdain for the man in red will turn into a terrible mistake. Lieutenant Carton is not just a security guard. He is a man who has more rights than someone who starts judicial wars. And this judge will not escape retribution. London. It's morning. The sun was just beginning to clear the thick fog, and the city was still asleep. Lieutenant James Carton, as always on time, walked through the streets to one of the country's most magnificent judicial institutions, the Royal Courts of Justice. His red uniform glistened in the sun, and the white hat on his head seemed to be a real symbol of unbreakable dignity. Cardboard, without any emotion, passed by ordinary Londoners who stopped to take pictures of him on their phones. For them, it was just another element of the solemn picture of London, a symbol of the Royal Guard, which stands guard over traditions. But today his role was completely different. He was not at his post outside Buckingham Palace. He was on his way to court as a witness in a theft case that he had witnessed by chance a few weeks ago. It seemed like nothing out of the ordinary, a simple case that would be resolved in a few minutes. But from the very first step into the courtroom, James felt that something was wrong. As soon as he stepped into the courtroom, all eyes instantly turned to him. Everyone knew that court is a place where everyone wants to be clear, strict, and professional. And here he was, in his red uniform, with a huge hat, standing among the dark gray robes of lawyers, prosecutors, and judges like a lighthouse in a storm. People could not help but notice him, and most of them didn't know that this man was not just a guard, but a man who had been through more than they could ever imagine. He approached the witness stand with absolute balance, as if his every move was part of a complex choreography. He had no room for error, no room for doubt. Carton was a military man, and he was responsible not only for the honor of his service, but also for his dignity, which he could not allow to be violated in any way. "Lieutenant Carton, please take a seat," the court clerk called to him, his voice echoing in the stone walls. Stopping, Carton took a few steps to his position. He took the witness stand, keeping his eyes fixed on the judge's bench. With his calm posture and indifferent expression, he looked as if it was a mundane task to sit there and wait for the case to be completed. But something about this situation was different than usual. He noticed the stares, more than usual, and there was some discomfort in their focus. He could feel Judge Richard Lake looking at him through his glasses, carefully and, it seemed, with a little distrust. "Nice suit," he said, not hiding the irony in his voice. Carton replied silently, continuing to stand in his seat, expecting the judges to not delay the trial. But Lake didn't seem intent on simply moving on with the case. "You don't seem to realize that this is a court of law, not some kind of carnival parade," the judge continued. His voice was sharp and not professional at all, but rather dismissive. The cardboard held up, as always, discipline and neutrality. But there was something in his eyes that not everyone noticed, a small spark of anger. Judge Lake sat in his seat, but his eyes never left Lieutenant Carton off. The guardsman sat like a rock, with an expression that betrayed only discipline and neutrality, but it was clear to everyone in the room that there was more to this than just testifying in a theft case. "I'm sorry, but this suit has no place in my court," the judge said again, his tone even colder and his voice sharper. "Do you really think this is an appropriate look for a legal institution?" Lieutenant Carton did not budge. He stood like a statue, showing no emotion. "Your Honor, this suit is part of my job description." His voice remained even, but with an inner pressure, as if every word was chosen with great care. "I am on official duty, and according to royal instructions, I must be in full uniform when called upon to perform my duties. So, this is just another performance for you?" Lake would not be appeased. He leaned forward, staring intently at Cartonoff. His words sounded like a reproach, as if he was trying to make the guardsman an object of public humiliation. Carton did not respond immediately. He knew that any emotional reaction was a loss, and he would not allow his feelings to defeat his professionalism. But the question was too personal. "This is not a performance, Your Honor," he said quietly, but with a clear emphasis on each word. "This is my duty. I serve my country and the Queen. And, in the end, if we are talking about theater, I think that anyone who wears the robe of a judge should perform no less publicly." The room fell silent. It was a moment when even the most fiercely held notions of honor and dignity could begin to shrink into a knot. The cardboard was more than just a military item. It was a symbol of discipline, of values that were sometimes alien to those who judged. Judge Lake, realizing that he would not break this man easily, changed his tactics. He went back to the case, trying to keep a straight face and concentrate on the testimony, but his eyes kept returning to the guardsman. Every time he looked at Kardinov, you could see his expression change from condemnation to interest. "Let's get back to the point," Lake said with almost forced calmness, although his voice still sounded angry. "The case can be heard without you being present like this, can it?" "I'm here as a witness, and my testimony is relevant to the case," Cardin replied calmly, his voice flat but with an inner pressure. "If I do not fulfill my duties, it will be a violation of the rules, both military and civilian." The judge, as if trying to keep control of the situation, jerked his gavel. "Don't tell me how to run my business here." Lake seemed to lose it and spoke again, his words coming out in a rage. Cardboard remained unmoved, but the tension in the room was becoming more and more palpable. There was no longer any room for doubt. This was not just a conflict between a judge and a witness, but a real battle for power and respect. And although Carton remained calm, he knew that this story would not end with a simple corroboration of the testimony. Something big was brewing, and he would be ready to stand to the end. Judge Lake's fingers tightened on the gavel, but instead of striking again, he fell silent for a few seconds. The situation was out of control, and he knew it. The courtroom shuddered in silence. The atmosphere became dense, as if the air had thickened. Everyone felt that something was about to happen. Judge Lake leaned forward. His gaze was not just irritation, but a deep, long-held anger that he could not contain. Perhaps he saw in Carton all the things he had never been: self-discipline, honor, restraint. Perhaps he just didn't like the fact that this silent man in a bright uniform commanded more respect in the room than he did in his robe, behind the raised podium. "Don't you think, Lieutenant," Lake said coldly, "that your ability to stand still is worth less than your ability to apply logic and reason?" The prosecutor visibly twitched, about to object, but Carton raised his hand, not defiantly, but calmly, and thus stopped any attempts at defense. "My service has taught me more than just standing guard," he said quietly. His voice was neither angry nor humiliating. There was no self-defense in it, only facts. "I have been in operations in Bamiyan, Kandahar, and Syria. I pulled the wounded from under fire, defused mines in schools where children were sitting. I took up my post near the palace after that, not the other way around." Several people in the room held their breath. The judge seemed to stand still for a moment, but then something in him broke. His right arm tensed, and his eyes flashed with resentment. "Are you trying to embarrass me?" he snarled. "This is my court, and I decide what is appropriate here. I worked for Themis for 30 years before you even learned to distinguish your right hand from your left." Cardboard was silent. His gaze remained steady, calibrated, like a scope. He didn't provoke, he just held his ground. And it was this lack of fear that finally pissed Lake off. At one point, the judge grabbed an engraved wooden gavel. His movement was sudden, uncontrollable, and with an almost silent, gravitational gesture, he threw it directly at Cardinovii. Silence. Gravity worked slowly. It seemed that the hammer was flying for an eternity. People in the room stood up from their seats. The prosecutor shouted, but too late. But the lieutenant did not flinch. His hand moved like lightning, not theatrically, without pathos, but with the precision that could be studied in military academies. He caught the gavel in midair before it crossed the witness stand. The room was dead silent. Not a rustle, not a breath. Carton looked directly at the judge. There was no anger in his eyes, only calmness. But this calm was more frightening than any scream. "Your Honor," he said evenly, turning the gavel and carefully placing it on the table in front of him, "you have just committed physical aggression against a military officer on active duty. This is a criminal offense under Article 39 of the Criminal Code." Judge Lake went white. His hands were trembling slightly. The people in the room kept their eyes on the guardsman, who had just not only caught the wooden symbol of power, but also deprived it of its meaning. The judiciary could not break the silence. And now its symbol was in the hands of the one it was trying to humiliate. But Carton was not done yet. His voice sounded clear, without aggression, What you have done is also a direct violation of the judicial code of conduct. You lost control, succumbed to emotions, and committed a physical act against the witness. This requires immediate review by an independent commission, and it is no longer your business, Your Honor." The judge said nothing. He remained silent until the gravity of his own fall, not the hammer, began to pull him down. The seconds dragged on like an eternity. Judge Lake was frozen in his chair, his face as pale as the wall behind him. He, like everyone else in the room, could not believe what had just happened. And what had happened was something no one could have predicted. He, the supreme figure in the courtroom, had thrown the symbol of his power at the witness, and the witness had calmly caught it, as if to deny everything Lake thought he was. The first to break the silence was an elderly man in the third row. Gray-haired, wearing a strict suit, with a small gold badge on his lapel, he stood up and spoke clearly. "Commodore David Grayson, retired from the Royal Navy. I personally attest to the attack on an active duty serviceman. This is not just a violation, it is a crime of honor." Another man stood up next to me, a retired colonel, also a veteran. People started turning around and getting up from their seats. The courtroom, which usually reigned in order and fear, had now become an arena for the truth that had broken through the facade of bureaucracy. The judge opened his mouth, wanted to say something, but couldn't. His throat was tight, his words stuck somewhere between shame and fear. He leaned forward and leaned on the edge of the bench, but he no longer had that look of confidence and arrogance. He looked like a man who had just been undressed not physically, but morally. His authority was destroyed not by voice or force, but by silence and precision. And then the courtroom door opened with a click. A woman entered, wearing a black robe with a blue edging. Judge Lauren Gale of the Supreme Magistrates Court. Her appearance was as unexpected as thunder in a cloudless sky. I received an internal signal about a possible incident in the courtroom. Her voice was as steel as a blade. Without waiting for permission, the court clerk approached her and handed her a printout, the official transcript, with the full sequence of events, including insults, denials, humiliation, and finally an act of physical aggression. Lake tried to stand up. His words made no sense. It was a provocation. He made me sit down, Lauren Gale said. And in that sit down was more power than in all his previous speeches in 30 years. A judge who throws a hammer at a witness has no right to pronounce any sentence. You were relieved of your duties pending the investigation. Judge Lake looked down for the first time that day. Now he looked neither overbearing nor stern. His posture broke like the frame of an old house after a storm. The guards approached him slowly, without unnecessary gestures, and he did not resist. It was as if his robe had become heavier, not the garment, but the weight of the decisions that now hung over his life. Lieutenant Carton did not move. He did not win, did not triumph. His face was as calm as ever. But something new appeared in the depths of his gaze, a heavy shadow of experience that even today's scene could not surpass. "Lieutenant," Gale said, "your behavior was impeccable. You demonstrated restraint, dignity, and a remarkable presence of mind." "I was only doing my duty, ma'am," he replied quietly. "Are you prepared to give an official statement?" "Yes, I am. And not just as a military man." A moment's pause. "I'm a lawyer. I have a degree in law from Oxford and worked in the Justice Corps during peacekeeping missions. My documents are in the archives of the Ministry of Defense." There was shock in the courtroom. The judge who had tried to make him look like a clown had just learned that his opponent knew the law, perhaps better than he did. No one applauded. But the silence was louder than the applause. Judge Richard Lake sat alone in his chambers behind a thick wooden door that now seemed to him not a symbol of power but a trap. His robe, which had seemed like an extension of his own self in the morning, lay crumpled on his chair. His own hammer, now a piece of evidence in a criminal case, was packed in a transparent bag on the table next to him. He looked at it as if it were a weapon he had lost in battle, having failed to study his opponent and underestimated him. In a few hours, the news spread through legal circles. A judge with many years of experience was suspended for assaulting a military witness. Eyewitness accounts began to appear on social media, and one of the participants in the trial, a Royal Navy veteran, published an open statement in support of Lieutenant Carton. Furthermore, other lawyers who had been afraid to speak out for years began to come forward with their own stories of emotional abuse by Lake that had gone unpunished for decades. An official investigation was opened the next day. Although the decision was still pending, everyone realized that there would be no turning back. At the Royal Guard headquarters, a major general put the report on his desk and signed a short order: Lieutenant James Carton. maintained honor and dignity under pressure, maintained his composure where most would have lost theirs, represented the army at the highest level. A note was added to his personal file, recommended for promotion. And while the entire London legal community was digesting the shock of the events, Lieutenant Carton stood at his usual post in front of Buckingham Palace. His posture was impeccable, his gaze into eternity. Tourists, unaware of the morning's drama, took pictures of him, admired his stamina and form, not realizing that in less than a day this man had stood up not to a crowd, but to injustice that threatened from the highest point of the judiciary. He did not change on the outside, but something did change inside. His silence now meant more than hundreds of sentences, because behind it was not just years of service. He stood for the truth. Later, in an interview, a journalist asked, "You were unarmed, humiliated in public, and yet you did not raise your voice. How did you do it?" Carton paused. True strength is not in fighting back. It's in standing up when even the truth seems inconvenient. I did not serve for medals, and not for respect, but for the sake of order, which must remain even when others betray it. He left the frame, leaving behind a silence that spoke more than any headline. The ending.